journalist in Turkey, I noticed a pattern emerging in my engagement with Twitter. I would write a post critical of the government, perhaps something relating to police brutality or a high-profile arrest or maybe a new censorship law. I would hesitate, I would reconsider it, edit what I'd written, and finally post it. But then a few minutes later, often I would delete the post. I'd then feel guilty about self-censoring, and I'd ask myself whether I'd become a bad journalist. So I resolved to be braver next time. But then, a few hours later, I would read all the death threats and rape threats on my timeline, and I would turn off my location on the Twitter app, and I would vow to be more careful again. So it was a cycle of fear and self-loathing. I'm aware that many of the threats directed against me were not generated by human beings, but by bots. But some of them were generated by human beings. I'm also aware that it's unlikely that people could find out where I live, but it's not impossible. And that tiny likelihood can destroy your capacity for truth-telling. I've been arrested in Turkey, and I've learned to notice when my phone is being tapped. These are things that you have to get used to as a journalist. But learning not to tell the truth is something that no journalist should ever get used to. In early 2017, I was finally barred from Turkey, so I am theoretically free to kick my fearful Twitter habits, but I haven't. Self-censorship is an instinct that stays with you for a long time after you've left a repressive regime. It is governed by subtle shades of fear. You may be outside the country where your life or liberty was threatened, but you're not necessarily safe. In a world where everyone can read what you write on the internet, where your friends and family can be targeted overseas, and when you yourself can be targeted by government agents, as we have seen most recently and most dramatically in the case of Jamal Khashoggi, Exile does not really exist. Maybe in future, there will be a patchwork of countries whose own citizens can write freely, but nowhere will be entirely safe for everyone, and that will be to the detriment of free speech everywhere. Because if exile no longer exists, neither does real freedom. In February, the Turkish best-selling novelist Ahmet Altan and his brother Mehmet Altan, another public intellectual, were found guilty of the improbable crime of sending subliminal messages imperceptible to normal consciousness to the plotters of the 2016 failed coup during their appearance on a TV show. Now, personally, I think Ahmet Altan is a writer of such caliber that he is indeed imperceptible to normal consciousness, but I don't think the court was referring to his intellectual capacity. The Altan brothers are among roughly 150,000 people, many of them writers, journalists, and academics, arrested or dismissed from their jobs in the last 2 years on charges of involvement or support for the failed coup. Thousands more have left the country or have had their passports revoked. Turkey is not just undergoing a brain drain, but it is on a huge scale, but it is also administering a kind of lobotomy on itself. In 2016, shortly before I was barred from Turkey, I went to visit the novelist Aslı Erdoğan, who's also a journalist, in Bakırköy's women's prison in Istanbul. It's a really scary place to go. It's next to this leprosy hospital, Istanbul's last leprosy hospital. It has high walls with barbed wire. It's got a gendarme on the watchtowers. And I really had to steel myself even to go. And they wouldn't let me in because I wasn't a close family member, nor was I a lawyer. And prisoners such as Erdoğan, Aslı Erdoğan, no relation, by the way, to the president, are not allowed visitors, really. Prison regulations in Turkey are now so tight that writers are forbidden from receiving books, paper, or pens from their few visitors on the grounds that they might be used as physical weapons against their guards. And this is something that is unprecedented in Turkey, even after the 1980 military coup, which is considered some of the darkest days in recent Turkish penal history. Books were never banned. I should add that Ahmet Altan is also barred from the library of Silivri, the notorious maximum security prison where he and many other so-called terrorists are being held. So I just want you to take a moment to imagine that, actually, as we sit here in this conference, exchanging ideas, speaking, listening. As we do that, the very best of Turkey's intellectuals are not even allowed to read in a prison cell. Now, let alone the pitiable situation that is, it's just a waste. It's a sheer waste of intellectualism, of power, of the opportunity to help a country desperately in need. It's just being taken from us. And it's a sign of how scared the Turkish government is of free thinkers. I should add that most of the writers and academics in these high security prisons are not allowed to write as well as read, but somehow, miraculously, books do get written in Turkish jails, I am pleased to report. For example, last year, Selahattin Demirtas, who is the leader of the opposition party, the HDP, he's in jail for life on terrorist charges. He's also a musician and a poet. He wrote a collection of short stories called Seher, which was published, and also a poem called Contagious Courage, which has been banned as terrorist propaganda. The year before saw the publication of the memoir We Are Arrested by the journalist Can Dündar, who was editor of Cumhuriyet newspaper, who's another Silivri inmate, and he's now in exile in Germany. These men, like Altan, are all public intellectuals who have been convicted of terrorist charges. I've always been intrigued by the stigma attached to the word intellectual. Now, I'm half British, and the British part of me cringes from the sort of the pretentiousness of the word. I wouldn't want to apply it to myself. But there's obviously a more sinister stigma now attached to it. In 1974, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that the intellectual is someone who meddles in what does not concern him. Now, I think that could be true for many of us today. And today, the term intellectual is a term quite often applied to academics and critical writers and journalists who dare to question the status quo. I'm choosing to use the term in a more broad sense to mean writers, journalists, academics, as well as certain bloggers and activists. As a journalist in exile myself, I am both professionally and personally attuned to the ridiculing or condemnation of critical newspapers by political leaders or state-supporting media, and I think it's an attitude which treads a thin line with the targeting of individual journalists, as we've seen many times. And in fact, it is a slippery slope to the criminalization of criticism itself. President Trump may exclude journalists from his White House presser while Erdogan jails them, and they're very different actions, but they are both on the same punitive spectrum. In early 2017, the Washington Post unveiled a new slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." When I read it, I thought immediately of Turkey, which has foreshadowed to some extent what we are now seeing in Europe and America. Democratically elected leaders who swiftly become allergic to criticism, polarization among voters, and most worryingly, acclimatization to hate-filled rhetoric. Free thinkers provide clarity. If you shut them up, you also shut out the light. Hence, democracy dies in darkness. And by the way, I often get a sense of déjà vu when I'm reading the American press at the moment. I feel as if Erdogan is in some ways a trendsetter in his own way. So watch that space. I am not claiming that only an elite band of people can identify the truth, that only intellectuals can give us all the answers. But there must be basic standards of veracity, at least in mainstream media. As a journalist, I'm particularly concerned about the emergence of a sort of Alice through the looking glass world, where apparently the public can no longer tell the difference between what is real and what is fake. And this is not necessarily new. I feel I've heard that sentence a lot during this conference. It's not new. Conspiracy theories have always been around, but it has become more pronounced in the age of the internet. And I also think journalists carry a certain amount of responsibility for taking sides too enthusiastically. When journalists become combatants in a war not just of competing opinions but of competing facts, the natural conclusion, in the age of the internet, is a nightmarish scenario: competitive crowdsourcing of the truth. In May this year, Elon Musk, who has his own problematic relationship with the truth, I might add, proposed a website where the public can rate journalists and their articles, like on TripAdvisor or Yelp. So I could write an article, for example, and it would be put on this website, and my article would receive a truth score of, say, 10 or 2.1, who knows. Even if Elon Musk doesn't go ahead with this, I think someone else will, and very soon. The game is already on, flourishing in the competitive world of clickbait, and worryingly in a political climate where leaders such as Trump and Erdogan refer to critical journalists as enemies of the state. Again, I'm going to roll out this line that this is not new. The efforts of political leaders to define an acceptable and patriotic standard of truth are not new, but it's happening. It's not so much a trend as a kind of social malaria that flares up periodically when our democratic immune system is low, and it's flaring up right now. Sartre identified the intellectual community headed by Émile Zola in the late 19th century as the men and women who first attracted the label intellectual as a pejorative term. And this was because of their support for the Jewish army officer Alfred Dreyfus, falsely convicted of treason. And this was a conviction that was widely supported by an anti-Semitic French public at the time. By extension, these Dreyfus-supporting intellectuals were seen as traitors too, because they were more loyal to their own convictions than to their country. And this is a pattern that is emerging once more in Europe and the United States. For example, in the case of the American football player Colin Kaepernick, who decided in 2016 to take a knee rather than sing the national anthem in protest at racial inequality and police violence. He was predictably branded a traitor. So, much of what we're experiencing today in the relationship between government and free speech, or I should say free thought, is not new, but we must become especially wary when the literature of dead writers starts resembling our present-day reality. The science fiction of the 1950s is increasingly looking like social prediction to me. Turkey is mirroring the books of George Orwell, as well as the world of Ray Bradbury's 1953 novel Fahrenheit 451, where books are illegal, and those who harbour them are considered dangerous dissidents, their minds poisoned by literature. One of the illicit book hoarders in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 is a man called Faber, who builds expensive electronic equipment to communicate with other dissidents. He finances this by playing the stock market, the last refuge of the dangerous intellectual in search of a job, in the words of Ray Bradbury, and an activity that could definitely be described as meddling in what does not concern them, in the words of Sartre. It is impossible not to think of George Soros in this context. The man who in 1992 famously broke the Bank of England with his short sale of pound sterling, and who made a fortune in betting on outcomes he did not necessarily want. He has donated his billions to liberal and anti-nationalist causes around the world, and is accordingly villainized as a political puppet master by nationalists and conservative Americans in particular, a characterization that has recently moved, as the New York Times has put it, from the fringes to the mainstream of Republican politics. Mr. Timmermans earlier today said that his hope for the future, I pointed, I don't think he's actually here, it's just metaphorical. Mr. Timmermans said that his hope for the future rested in civil society. Now that sounds great, but on Monday, for example, the Soros Open Society Foundation announced, which funds civil society groups across the world, announced that it was closing its operations in Turkey because of repeated accusations by Erdogan that Soros financed the political protests in Gezi Park in 2013. And incidentally, last month, Trump publicly accused Soros of paying people to protest outside the Kavanaugh hearing. So, in a way, George Soros has become arguably the poster boy of the dangerous intellectuals. Someone who, if Erdogan had his way, and no doubt if Trump had his way, would wind up in a prison cell next to Ahmet Altan, another dangerous intellectual. So, what do we do when the truth is so severely politicized, when our freedom of speech is threatened in some places almost to extinction, and when conspiracy theory becomes gospel? I don't have the answer. Clearly, I got it wrong. So did Elon Musk. His solution of truth scoring will only exacerbate the problem, in my opinion. Perhaps the solution lies in education, in teaching younger generations critical thinking geared towards the problems of free speech and fake news. The Guardian has already piloted a scheme like this in London schools this year. Perhaps it will catch on, perhaps not. I can't see it taking off in countries like Turkey, and even if it did, I would be worried, frankly, about the content and the agenda of these classes. Any curriculum is to some degree politicized. History syllabuses are under review in education ministries in Europe as I speak. And it would be difficult to teach classes in fake news apolitically. As Professor Dresner pointed out earlier today, even a simple photo can be misconstrued or construed, whatever, in various ways. So it's a very difficult thing to teach, especially to young people. But perhaps at this stage it's necessary to try. In any democracy, so much depends on our ability to speak truth to power. In fact, everything else depends on it. I, for one, would not like to live in a future where my articles receive a truth score generated by bots, or indeed by human beings. And more importantly, I don't want to live in a world where my freedom of movement is dictated by my freedom of speech. The Turkish journalist Can Dündar, who is now in Germany, but was in prison, once told me that when he was in prison, he was finally free to write because he was no longer afraid of being put in prison. That's a truth as counterintuitive as its opposite, that even in exile, a writer is not safe to write. Countries like Turkey need more writers, more teachers, more journalists out there, not fewer. It's a cruel irony that the countries who most need brave and intelligent voices are often the ones who try to silence them. We must reverse that. Luckily, of course, it's also the case that these countries produce the most brave voices because they have to be. The more we allow intellectuals to be locked up, the more we will make a collective prison cell of the human mind. Thank you very much.